today on the podcast, we are focusing on how to cultivate gratitude. As we head into the holiday season, it is an excellent time to pause and be thankful for what we have, especially with Thanksgiving coming up. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about that. We're also going to give you some ideas to help cultivate gratitude in your life. Hope you'll join me today for this episode.
Welcome to a More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. We know that in the hectic hurry of everyday life, it's easy to lose sight of what really matters. This is a moment to pause and realign your focus on the one who gives us peace and rest. We're focusing on discipleship, productivity, and homemaking as we live with eternity in mind. This is the place where you'll learn to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 14 of a More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. I'm your host, Casey Fletcher, and today we are going to be focusing on gratitude. So as we head into the holiday season, I've mentioned that we're going to be focusing on some seasonal episodes to focus on how to cultivate gratitude, ways to celebrate traditions in your life, turning our focus to Christmas. We'll look at some things with the Advent season. And we'll still continue some of our systematic theology episodes and also some other episodes, some practical episodes to help you continue to create a life you love. And so all of those things will be happening in the next few weeks, but it won't be the alternating episodes that we have been doing so far in this season. And so, like I said, today I wanted to take a moment and think about how to cultivate gratitude in our lives. As we go into, we're in the States, and so it's about to be Thanksgiving. We talk a lot about being thankful and showing gratitude. But then it's so funny how it's like we have this whole holiday talking about how thankful we should be. And literally the next day, everybody celebrates Black Friday, and you go out at 2 o'clock in the morning to shop to get the best deals to buy as much as you possibly can. And the whole idea behind a lot of the commercialization of Christmas is that you have to get more and more and more. Amazon is sending out the books for kids where they have stickers and all these pictures of toys, and my son got it in the mail, and he's like, I want this and I want this and I want this. And so this is the time of year where that happens, where we have this focus on how much can we get, how much can we spend, and then we don't think about the ramifications of all of that until we get to January. And so I really want us to think about this idea of gratitude. As we've been thinking about creating a life we love, we've been talking about that on this season of the podcast. I think it's probably about half and half between our efforts and our habits and our actions, how we cultivate a life we want to live, and the other part that actually makes a lovely life. The other 50% is our attitude. Whenever we started talking about this, the first thing that we've said is that we have to rightly order our desires. I think rightly ordering our desires is an example of trying to change our mindset and our attitude and get everything mentally under control. And then, and only then, can we turn our focus onto the actual things that we do? Yes, I think there's things in life that it's important that we take the time to create habits that we love, to add in things that we love to do, to spend time with people that inspire us to live better lives. All of those things are important. And so, yes, we definitely need to make sure that we are taking the time to do those things. But if we never focus on our desires and our attitude, then really we're just going to be going through the motions. And at some point, we'll feel pleasure maybe at some of the goals that we've met, but that pleasure is very fleeting. And pretty soon, after you've accomplished the things that you set out to do, you're going to be feeling very discontent, and then you're going to strive for more. So it's always that, example of making money, where people say, well, if only I had this, then I'll be happy. So if only you had this car or this mini car garage or whatever. And after you've met that goal and you've bought the house that has a big garage, then you start to set your sights on a house that has a 3-car garage. And so it's just something that you really never get to the point where you're satisfied if your attitude is not in the right place. So as we go into the holiday season, I think it's a great time to check our motivations and check our attitudes so that we're able to celebrate this time well. But it's also just it's a habit and a lesson and a mentality that we have to continue to work at, I think, our whole lives. I think it's a natural human tendency, maybe because of sin or our sinful nature, to always lean towards discontentment. And so, if you think about the 10 Commandments right now in our homeschool, we're trying to learn the 10 Commandments, which I didn't realize there's a Johnny Cash song that goes through the 10 Commandments. So we've been listening to that every day. But there's the 10 Commandments, and you have the first 5 or so commandments that talk about our relationship with God. But then whenever we turn to the commandments that talk about our horizontal relationships with other people, so many of them really have to deal with this idea of discontentment. If we think about stealing and envying other people, all of those things are related to this idea of wanting what somebody else has. And so you're trying to get that from them, so that maybe you don't have to work for that or try to cultivate that through the hard work that you do. You just try to steal it from somebody else. And so I think really we have to make sure that we spend time really investing in this attitude of contentment in our lives, because in doing that, it'll keep us out of the path of sin. In Proverbs, they talk about finding pleasure and finding, contentment and happiness in the wife of your youth. And there's always this idea that if you start to look out and say, okay, no, the grass is greener on the other side, you really very easily can get into trouble and you end up in the path of that foolish woman, the adulteress. And so, I think there's the literal example of that, which happens in marriages, but then there's also, that figurative example where, that adulteress is that temptation, that sin. And so, every sin in some ways is enticing us through discontentment. And if we find our contentment in God, then we can avoid this. And I think the way to get that contentment is through gratitude. We cultivate this attitude of contentment by being thankful. And especially, I think, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but I think sometimes people, whenever they're talking about being thankful for something, they think about being thankful and it's just this idea of like saying maybe thank you to somebody, or, we have this idea of being thankful at Thanksgiving. So you think of like one thing that you're thankful for. But at Thanksgiving, you have to say, okay, well, who are you giving thanks to? So I think thankfulness, it has to be attached to this element of praise and worship. And I think that's why people really don't know whenever we say, oh, you need to be thankful, you need to practice gratitude. It's like they don't know who they're being grateful for. Very well could be, if you've had a long day at work and you come home and your spouse has dinner ready for you, or maybe the house is a mess and, especially from like a mom's point of view, the house is a mess, that's your job. You leave, you go do something, and then you come home and the house is clean and that job is taken off your plate. You might be thankful to your spouse for that. But I think for everyday life, like having a good spouse, who are you thankful for that to? And I think the answer to that should be you're thankful to God because God gives every good and perfect gift. It says that in James 1. And so I think to cultivate gratitude and contentment, it always ties in with this element of praise. So if you aren't praising God for what you've received, then I think you're still going to fall into this trap of discontentment later on, because when things don't go your way, or maybe the people around you, you're not really thankful for what they're doing, you're a little bit annoyed, things can start to get off kilter, a little bit skewed. So I was thinking about gratitude a couple years ago, and one of the things that I noticed is the difference in my types of students. And you could think about this with your kids, maybe people that you know at work or at your church. But I noticed with my students that we always had 2 different kinds of students, right? you have the go-getters who have their projects done about 2 weeks in advance. They're the ones that, they do pretty well in school. They're the ones that get annoyed whenever I'm like, well, maybe we won't do homework tonight because we have this big project coming up. And they're like, well, I did it last week. How could you do this to me? Because they work ahead and they have their stuff done and they're responsible. And so they are the ones that are determined to get that 100. They're overachievers. They study. And, we, in general, is like that is the type of student that you really want to look for in your classroom. Most students never fell categories of, overachievers, responsible, perfectionistic students. Most of the time, kids did assignments because they wanted to make sure that they didn't get the bad grade that they would receive if they didn't do the assignment or do it well. They didn't want to make their parents mad. They didn't want to, have that grade on their report card. They didn't want to say they had a C in class. Maybe they finally get the assignment done because, I'm emailing the parents and saying, hey, just want you to know, we have this assignment. Your child has not even started on it. And it was due last week. And so they haven't completed their work after a few weeks of working on the assignment in class. For these students, these things get done because they have to get done because some outside force is pressuring them to get it done. So you have a very few that are motivated themselves by wanting to do a good job or wanting to get the best grade that they can receive so that they know that they've received it and that they've earned it. But for most kids, especially in middle school, it's very much something that an outside force. They're kept in from, recess or outside time to do the work. And so because of that, they're going to get it done, but they won't work on it for 2 weeks prior in class time because they just don't want to. And the root of this problem, it gets much deeper than the nature of the assignment. Like, yeah, okay, not everybody likes writing essays, but generally kids that have this issue, it's an issue in every single class, and it's also an issue in things outside of school. It's based on an issue of the heart. For these students, they struggle maybe with the purpose of the assignment. Maybe they think it's like, oh, what's the point in any of these things that I have to do? And so because of that, they rely on these outside motivations that are extrinsic and punitive. Like if you don't get this done, parents might say, I'll ground you. Or a teacher might say, you're going to have, detention or whatever. And so you could think of all the phrases maybe that you heard yourself as a kid, or maybe that you tell your kids now that recognize how, this motivation is enforced. If you say, because I said so, because you have to, because it's the right thing to do, we're trying to tell our kids, it's like, look, you need to do this assignment just because you need to. It's your responsibility. It's your duty. Instead, the kids say, oh no, I'm not going to do that unless I get this consequence. And so I think for most of us, a few of us are definitely those go-getter students, right? That I mentioned at the beginning, where we are responsible, we get stuff done ahead of time, we want to make sure that we get the best grades that we can. And even though, you might have been that way whenever you were in school, I think in some areas of life, we all fall into this third category. Yes, might not be the third category related to schoolwork, but you might feel that way about housework, about meal planning, about your budget, about doing stuff, have you cleaned your gutters this year or last year? Some of these things, you have people who are go-getters about that kind of stuff. Like they will not sleep until, their house and all their housework is finished, or their yard work. But you have other people that is the last thing on their priority list, and they are not going to do anything until there's the punitive consequence of their gutters are causing their basement to flood or something like that. And so I think in these moments, if we feel like we can't find the purpose in what we're doing, we feel like we're going through the motions and we're not dedicated to any purpose, we're just floating through life with these outside forces kind of driving us and directing us. But it's almost this thing of like, if there's not a fire, if it's not broke, we're not going to fix it. We're just going to float through life until there's something that is a extreme thing that makes us have to turn our focus to that and try to fix it. And we have to ask ourselves, like, why do we let ourselves get this way, where we float through life and we let a lot of things fall through the cracks? And I think it's because, just like my students we're relying on some outside force that tends to be our motivator and that gives us purpose to our lives. So you have to ask yourself, like, what is giving you purpose right now? What is making you wake up in the morning and do the best that you can in the things that you are doing? Are you giving the best that you can in these different responsibilities and areas of your life? So how do we get out of this fog? How do we breathe new life into our lives? How do we develop purpose in our lives? And I think part of it is we have to figure out how to change what's motivating us from, this outside force or this extrinsic force to something that's intrinsic, that is a heart issue. And it requires a heart shift, a change in how we view ourselves and our life. So I think this time of year can be excellent in switching this motivation. Basically, in teacher talk, and you probably have heard this before if you listen to other kind of self-help or productivity circles, but basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to shift your motivations from extrinsic motivations to intrinsic motivations. Extrinsic are those outside forces that make you do things just because of some consequence that you're going to get, or maybe it's somebody who is telling you have to do it, like your boss, or if you think like a honey-do list, it's not somebody who is the intrinsic motivation of the husband to say, okay, I'm going to go and fix all these things. Instead, it's the extrinsic motivation of the wife saying, you need to fix this, and asking them to do it every day. And so in those situations, the extrinsic motivation is the driving force. Now, there are times where extrinsic motivation is necessary and it's what you will rely on. Where, like I said in a previous podcast, I'm due in December, so we're gonna have a new baby, and there's a lot of extrinsic motivations going on during those newborn days where, it's not that you want to wake up at 3:00 in the morning to feed the baby. It's that the baby is crying. And so that's what you just have to do. There's the intrinsic motivation of love and wanting to nurture and care. But in that moment, you're just thinking, okay, I got to do what I got to do so that I can get back to sleep. And so you're dealing with these outside forces. But for the long haul, you need to focus on shifting to developing some of those intrinsic motivations that help breathe new life into your purpose. Doing this heart shift where you're shifting from these extrinsic motivations to the intrinsic motivations is a great way of making sure that you are not going to get burnt out. Because again, I think that having these intrinsic motivations really leads to more purpose. We talked about at the beginning of this season about your ministry and cultivating ministry right where you're at, focusing on what you can do in this moment close by you. And one of the things related to this is making sure that you're finding purpose in wanting to do things well and do things for the glory of God, rather than having these extrinsic motivators of people just telling you what you should do or how you should feel in those moments. In the book of Luke, there's a story in chapter 17 about 10 men with leprosy. You may know the story. Leprosy was a serious skin disease, and so they were unclean. They couldn't be involved in any kind of social, religious practice. They had to live outside of the city, and they were just outcast. And so these men, they cried out to Jesus, and they begged Jesus to heal them. Jesus saw them, and he told them to go and show themselves to the priest, as was commanded in the Mosaic law. So that's in Leviticus 14. It commands, there's a few commands of how to deal with skin diseases and leprosy. The 10 men acted in faith, and they left to go to the priest, and on the way there, they were healed. I want to pause there just for a minute. Think of a time that your prayers were clearly answered. So you've been crying out to God, and you almost couldn't take it anymore, but you heard his still small voice and were comforted by it. So how did you respond when you recognized that the thing that you've been crying out for had been given to you by God? what was your response in that moment? Luke 17:15 picks up with one of the men returning to Jesus and giving thanks and glory to God. The rest of the men may have done what Jesus told them to do. They were obedient. They were obedient to the law and obedient to what Jesus told them to do, which was to go and see the priest. But they never stopped to thank God for what he had done. And all too often, I think that we're the same, where sometimes we recognize immediately when we see God working in our lives, and we stop and we give him glory for our answered prayers. But more frequently, I think we end up going about our days just like the 9 men who are healed. And so you have to ask yourself, which person were you in that story? Were you the person who, you've been praying for this, you've been asking for this, begging for this for so long, but whenever your prayer is answered, you just assume, you take it for granted. Like, well, of course it was answered, and you move on to your next test. And then really you move on to your next prayer request, and you never stop and thank God for that thing. Earlier in chapter 17, Jesus had been teaching the disciples, and he asked them an important question in verses 7 through 10. So when we're working for God, we tend to think that we're entitled not only to the original costly grace of Jesus' death on the cross, but also to the grace that we receive daily from God. We feel like we deserve that thing. Jesus says in verse 10, "When you have done all that you were commanded, you should say, 'We are good for nothing slaves. We've only done our duty.' Every display of grace is a gift." How do we respond to the gifts when we receive them? Like the one man who returned to Jesus, do we respond with thanks for those gifts, giving glory to God? I think living a life of gratitude involves recognizing the good things that come from God. And because of giving that glory to God for those things, we begin to cultivate that purpose in life. I think that's why, Paul talks about, godliness with contentment is great gain. And then we also have the verses that talk about how we should do everything for the glory of God. We do it excellently for the glory of God. And I think those things are connected, that whenever we're cultivating gratitude and contentment, we recognize the good gifts come from God. And then, because the good gifts come from God, we live a life of praise. And part of our praise is to do well with the things that are given to us. So if you think about this, your family is a good gift from God. And so if you have a family, you look at your family as an example of something that you should steward. So how can you steward your family well? Well, by discipling them, providing for them, making sure that they have what they need to incline themselves to God. Like, there's no formula to make sure that your family all follows after God, but there are things that you can do that increases the likelihood of that. And most of that is how you are as a person and the environment that you create for your kids. So that's just one example. Your money is the same thing. So your money comes from God. It's a good gift, and you give praise to God for that. You recognize it's not your own. And so then that means you try to steward it well through what you spend your money on. So at the same time that you're cultivating contentment, you're also cultivating wisdom, and you're doing things excellently because your motivations have changed. It's not, I feel this extrinsic motivation to put out the fires around me. If it was with your family, maybe you feel like, I don't want my kids to be annoying, or I don't want them to be disrespectful, so somehow I'm going to have to fix this problem. And so that's your motivation for trying to discipline them or set up some kind of consequences for them. But if you change your motivations to this intrinsic motivation of wanting to steward your family well, to live life excellently, the way that you discipline your kids is going to look more like discipleship than either the gentle parenting or the authoritarian parenting that we see popularized in culture today. So these are examples of how contentment and godliness and stewardship and these motivations, they all come from the same point. And it all comes from this idea of gratitude, cultivating gratitude. That praise, that gratitude, that thankfulness is the thing that connects all of this and helps to make that complete heart shift. So how do we cultivate gratitude in our lives? So one of the things that I've done, and you guys, we've talked about this before, is, journaling and writing about this. I think one of the best ways that you can cultivate gratitude in your life is through a gratitude log. So keeping a journal or a daily log of ways that you're thankful. Now I've seen people, and you can get a copy of this on the blog, where they have a list and they just write out things maybe for the week or for the day that they're thankful for. You could do a 1 line a day thing. Part of my planner, what I do is I have basically it's just like literally a line. It's like not even enough for a real sentence, but I can write down something every day that is a memory that I'm thankful for. And it's a great way to journal and kind of keep track of these things. You can also keep an actual journal, so more of a long form journal, where you write about those moments. And I remember, I've been journaling for a long time. And so I would go back through and I would read through some of my responses. And sometimes you never even think about the things that you were concerned about, like a year ago, the things that were really a big deal to you. You may remember them, but you don't realize the gravity of the fact like, oh my goodness, those prayers were answered. I had prayed for the exact thing that I have now. So journaling can be a way to document some of your prayers, and it can lead you to praise. Another way to cultivate gratitude is to say thank you. So we talked about praising God, but it's good to practice this in every part of our lives so that we appreciate the people around us, and it's a way to show love to them. And so one of the great ways to show this thankfulness to other people is through thank you cards and phone calls and text. So if you get together with your friends, or if you are, especially in the holidays, if somebody hosts your holiday dinner, if somebody does something kind for you, or maybe they get you a present, all of these things are things that these people, they don't have to do. But it's so important to continue to do these things for other people, to show hospitality to other people, and to care for them and to love other people. And so I think it's an excellent way to kind of, bolster them up and care for them by us telling those people thank you. So yes, the same person may host everything, in your family, but you have to recognize hosting people, it means you have to clean your whole house, and you have to have, a meal prepared. A lot of times the host also is the person who's responsible for drinks and cups and, all that kind of stuff. And so those things, they're not little things. And so sending a thank you card or a text or a phone call is a great way just to say, well, thank you. And it's like, I see what you're doing and I appreciate it. And a lot of times we do appreciate it. We think in our minds, what a nice thing that they did, but we never say it out loud. And so I would encourage you to vocalize those things. It could be in the form of like a hostess gift, or again, just a little card or phone call, a text afterwards that says, hey, I really appreciate getting together. That was something that I was really looking forward to, and you did a great job. And something like that, it can be it's a balm to the soul, because it's something that encourages the other person for what they do, and it recognizes their hard work, and it encourages them to keep going. And I think we should always be thinking about how we can encourage people in ministry, but also, hospitality and the things I was just talking about, that's an example of a ministry, even though it doesn't happen in the church walls. And so we want to think about how we can support them in that. Lastly, I think it's important to show grace and kindness through your actions. So help those in need. Thanksgiving is a time where a lot of people, they start to, collect for food pantries. Some people go and they serve food on Thanksgiving. And so those are just a couple examples of how we can help those in need. But I think a great way to cultivate contentment is to get out of your head and look at other people and see, everybody else has lots of things going on. So what are just little small ways that you can go and you can support other people, whether it's people in your church family, whether it's your community through things like those soup kitchens or other service projects. But it's a great way to begin living a life of gratitude because you are choosing to serve and to take care of other people. And it just changes your mentality. So today, like I said, I wanted to just focus a little bit on gratitude and how to cultivate gratitude, why it's important to cultivate gratitude. As we think about living a life we love, we have to look at our attitude. And our attitude can easily fall into discontentment. And so gratitude is the best way to fight against this discontentment. If we leave discontentment unchecked, we can very easily become listless and purposeless, but we can also very easily get into sin, like I mentioned before. And so gratitude is an excellent way to call us back towards God and to cultivate a heart of praise to God for the things that we have. So I hope that you've enjoyed this today. I also hope that this has helped you get in the mood for Thanksgiving coming up, but then also for the rest of the holidays as they get closer. If you haven't yet, please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps others find the show. And you can also subscribe to the podcast and the blog so that you never miss an episode. Until next time, keep creating a life you love and cultivating your heart for God. Bye.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of a More Beautiful Life Collective podcast. If you haven't yet, please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts to help others find the show. While you're there, you can like and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Don't forget to check out the blog and our store for more encouragement and resources on how to create a life you love and cultivate your heart for God. I'm Casey Fletcher, and I'll see you next week.